everyone and welcome. Today we are going to talk about the history of zoos and how this industry evolved from the very first humans keeping animals in a human care setting to the professional zoos that you experience today. So where did it all start? Why did people start keeping animals in a human care setting? The initial reason could be that it was just plain curiosity and enjoyment. As with many things, humans have a strong curiosity about animals. Scientific studies show that we see chemical and physiological changes in our bodies when animals are around. Dopamine is released as well as endorphins, which make us feel great. So, think about why that is. Scientific research shows that humans are cued for protective rather than predatory or aggressive impulses when we see animals that have small, round, soft-looking eyes, large, close-together eyes, no teeth visible. What does that description sound like to you? Small children, possibly, babies. And in this case, when we're talking about animals, we especially think about mammals. So let's see how this makes you feel.
Shrek?
In both Shrek and the cat, you can see those round eyes, those loving looking faces as we interpret them. Now let's take a look at this. How does this make you feel?
I'm sorry. Was that your auntie?
Whoa, that is definitely a different feeling altogether. Well, I know there may be some of you out there that look at this face and you think, I think that's awesome. Look at how sharp those teeth are. This is really cool. This is obviously an animal who's very upset about the devastation of its family. And justifiably so, right? So put yourself in other people's shoes. We know that scaly and crazy looking creatures like this aren't necessarily the fan favorite. We have grown to love them. I have grown to love them in my life. I love snakes. I love invertebrates. I think the cooler and creepier they are sometimes, the better. But this is not, we are not part of the majority in that. A lot of humans have a lot of fears around invertebrates and snakes. So let's talk about who started keeping animals in captivity. Could it have been the hunter and gatherers? Well, when you think about this group, they couldn't necessarily afford the luxury of refusing to eat animals because they were beautiful or because they were cute or because they deserved respect. For them, animals were definitely revered, but they were typically used for food, shelter, clothing, and different aspects. And they used all of the animals to help support their lives. And in some cases, yes, they did hunt animals out of fear and out of the fear of being hurt. However, one exception to this rule about them using animals in a way in which it required them to be killed was probably that of dogs. Dogs were some of the earliest animals to be kept in a human care setting, and that probably started with young pups who were abandoned or whose parents were killed, and then the humans in that group brought them in and raised them, and those dogs then also became protectors of that population of humans. So how did this start to change? Well, as humans became more agricultural and grew into societies and started growing crops and started staying in more local areas, especially with that more pastoral society, they started to further domesticate animals. They were still using them as food resources, but they were also using them to pull carts. They were using them as transportation. They were using them to help plow the grounds for their crops. And so having them alive became of a greater value to some extent than having them dead. And at this point, we start to look at the four main reasons that animals were kept in a human care setting. So let's dive into that. Holy animals is our first reason. These animals were sacred, they were pampered, they were protected. Raising holy animals in the midst of a community is an ancient tradition. It reached its highest level in the Egyptian culture, which existed more than 3,000 years ago. Sacred animals were pampered in respective shrines all over Egypt. In 112 BC, there was a Roman city called Crocodiliopolis. In this area, the caretakers prepared a special meal for a holy crocodile so that a Russian senator might enjoy watching the crocodile eat. So that's something that we might do today in zoos when we're on a donor tour. These animals were well cared for by many people. Oftentimes they had their own buildings that they lived in. They had shrines. They had priests and nuns who were religious experts that cared for them. They were very revered. They had lots of space and lots of care. Not necessarily in the way we think of in terms of like ancient zoos, but in a way more like we would see of that of humans. When they died even, they were just like royalty or religious people, and they were mummified and they were placed in sarcophagi. The second reason that humans started keeping animals for themselves is that as, again, society became more stable and grew and started having money as a way of acquiring items, we saw people start acquiring animals. So the more animals you had, the richer you were considered to be. And it wasn't just about livestock as you see in these pictures. Some rich members of society would go on safaris and they would come back and they would bring live animals back with them to keep as part of their collection. We especially see this with kings who had their servants care for the animals, such like crocodiles or hippos that had been given to them as a gift. Others would capture lions to keep them in a human care setting and to be able to show them off. Because if you could handle a lion and care for a lion, you must either have a lot of money or have a lot of power, especially before we saw like currency taking place. So I have another movie clip for you. This is from Fiddler on the Roof, and it just shows how much this movie takes place in 1905, and it gives you an idea of the importance of livestock at this time.
If I were a bitty, bitty rich, idle, diddle, diddle, diddle man, I'd build a big tall house with rooms by the dozen, right in the middle of the town. A fine tin roof with the real wooden floors below. There would be one long staircase just going up, and one even longer coming down, and one more leading nowhere, just for show. I'd fill my yard with chicks and turkeys and geese and ducks for the town to see and hear, squawking just as noisily as they can. And each loud will land like a trumpet on the ear, as if to say, here lives a wealthy man.
So we see in this video clip how much he really thinks that having more animals and having them be noisy is a way to show that he is a wealthy man. Much like I had alluded to before, the royalty of this era and in these early times started really looking at animals from that pleasure standpoint. So no longer were they reliant specifically on animals in order to survive, but they had the luxury of being able to keep them for pleasure. So our third reason that animals started being cared for in a human care setting is simply the pleasure of collecting. So some of the rich collected these animals, not as much for the status symbol, but for the sheer pleasure of it. In 1500 BC, Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt was the first great woman in recorded history that maintained a zoo. And it actually did start to look like we would imagine zoos to look. She was famous for her African expeditions and returning with a variety of animals, including even giraffe. And if you look at this picture, you can see that she is not having the animals typically set up like we would see in a zoo situation. So you can see the monkey in the background, you can see the chicken behind her, you can see the goat sitting next to her. And then you can see the women who take care of her. They were also responsible for taking care of these animals. And here's a picture of what the Queen's grounds look like. So if you see this, you can see she was fully able to give the animals space and to keep them sectioned off from each other. And it starts to look like what you and I might think of as a zoo. Now, the final reason that we identify as why humans started keeping animals in a human care setting is to learn from. So, Chinese Emperor Wen Wang he founded the Garden of Intelligence, and this was a huge collection of China's animals. It covered over 1,500 acres. The main exhibit in this garden was a giant panda. Now, from what we know from history, that the animals were typically housed in metal cages, so something a little less luxurious than we might have seen with the Queen in the last slide. But they were displayed in a very extensive park-like setting. The zoo's title in this case alludes to the education potential of zoos back early in these times, so in 1000 BC. However, there was not much evidence that there was much education going on at this point. More like it was self-education and thoughtful experience with the animals. There were definitely other Chinese who interacted with this garden, who were noted to describe behaviors of certain birds and other animals. So they were definitely learning on their own from that. And we started to see a lot more of these pop up, especially in England around 1100 AD. The Spanish explorers in 1520 also had large collections of animals that they were looking at and learning from during this time. And then many of the early, more sophisticated, more formal zoos actually came from these royal collections. And that's what we start to see next. So to summarize, the 4 reasons that people started keeping animals historically is for holy animals, for displays of wealth and power, for the pleasure of collecting, and to learn from them. For your purposes, you're going to want to know these 4 reasons and remember examples for each. All right, now let's move on to the birth of today's zoos. To help us through this, I have put together a slide that shows you how the progression and the evolution of the zoo concept really got started. I added in the 18th century to this graphic because I think it's important that we acknowledge that a lot of this really started with menageries in the 18th century. We're going to move through the next few slides, and I am going to use this chart to help you move through those. So you'll definitely want to make a note of it and maybe even draw it in your notes for your own benefit. So with menageries, we see that they were largely taxonomic, not organized taxonomically, like with all the mammals together, all the reptiles together. Menageries were truly just a collection of captive animals. They were frequently exotic, typically kept for display, or in a place where such a collection would be kept, especially in, again, the situation of royalty. A lot of royals and people with money started these menageries. The term was first used in the 17th century France in reference to the management of household or domestic stock. This photo that you see on this slide shows how the panic sometimes of a traveling menagerie can happen. And this was actually depicted from a town hall in France. It's a piece of artwork from a town hall in France. And it shows that sometimes things did not always go well with these traveling menageries. Again, often created from personal collections, and animals were exhibited in cages to a large degree, like you see here. Now, menageries, as I've mentioned, they were started in early BC. The top picture on the left is the grounds at Versailles. And then the picture on the right is, again, art of a menagerie that was actually not a traveling menagerie, but a stationary menagerie in Great Britain. And then in the bottom left, we have the Manders Grand Star Menagerie that went from about 1912 to the 1930s in England. Their parents, Joseph and Ellen Manders, so those are the two that really started this menagerie, and they traveled around until about the 19th century, in which they had to sell off the animals. A lot of these collections turned into our modern zoos. And our first modern zoo that we're going to take a quick look at is Tiergarten Schönbrunn, which is also called the Vienna Zoo, and it opened in 1751. It is recognized as the world's oldest continuously existing zoo. It is appropriate, really, that this happened in the 1950s, around that same time, to give you sort of an idea of what was going on in the world. That's the same decade that Carolus Linnaeus published System Naturae. So that was the book that really laid the foundation for classification of animals as we know it today. Next up, we have the London Zoo. So we're starting to see this trend where the menageries of royalty turn into more official zoos. So like that of the Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt, they are now going into this formal structure, these public exhibits, and think more formal, more functional, more business-like. The London Zoo opened to members only in 1828, and the collection came largely from the Tower of London's menagerie, established in 1235 by Henry III of England. Because the animals were so expensive to keep, the zoo eventually opened to the general public in 1847. Now, over in the United States around this time, we see the Peel Museum show up. And the Peel Museum was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it is significant to our history of zoos because it is actually the first museum that displayed both taxidermy and live animals at the same time, making it unofficially the first living history museum concept. It had nearly 2,000 species of stuffed birds, and it had a mastodon skeleton that was excavated in 1801. But they also were displaying living bears, monkeys, a bald eagle, and more species. So again, this concept of the living history museum, not just a living museum, but a living history museum, is that there are both taxidermied specimen and live specimen. Next, we are going to look at the Philadelphia Zoo. So the Zoological Society of Philadelphia was established in 1859, but the zoo opened 15 years later, and that delay was because of the Civil War. As the Peel Museum ended, it had financial trouble staying going. Again, animals are expensive to care for. The Philadelphia Zoo took on many of its living species. The Philadelphia Zoo opened to the public in 1874. It is widely known as many of the things in Philadelphia are as America's first zoo. But I just might mention to you that New York's Central Park Menagerie started in 1861. Chicago's Lincoln Park Zoo opened in 1868. And the Roger Williams Park Zoo in Providence, Rhode Island started in 1872. So maybe not officially America's first zoo, but certainly, right, like I said, along with many of the things that are in Philadelphia, they consider themselves America's first zoo. Now, a couple of things to note about the pictures here. These are drawings and pictures from Philadelphia Zoo and around the time that it opened. And if you see in the largest photo that's sitting singly on the right-hand side, there is a couple of trees or tree trunks, if you will. There's not a lot of branches left on those trees. And there are bears in the tops of the trees. So think about what exhibits look like in that. We see a lot of kind of bear pit style where, yes, the animals have like one item that they can climb on, but largely people are looking down upon them or looking through bars at them. Another interesting thing to note is that Leo, the MGM lion that you hear roar on movies that are produced by MGM, that lion actually retired at the Philadelphia Zoo. And so this is where we start to see that some of those animals, after they have reached their level of usefulness in the entertainment industry or in other industries, circuses, that sort of thing, they come to retire at a zoo, in a zoo setting. All right, so now we're kind of moving up the scale. We're moving into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we start to see zoos become more organized in their collections. We see some significant changes, or we will see some significant changes in exhibit design. So if you look back at some of the slides that I just showed you, you can see that bars, asphalt, cages, that sort of typical thing that we think of in a cage setting is what you saw during that era. We see very kind of sterile. They were easy to clean. They were safe mostly for guests, so animals didn't get out. And at that time, we thought that's all they needed in order to survive. But we're starting to move into this era of what we call dioramas and how we are starting to incorporate more of the animal's natural environment into their exhibitry. So first we'll look at the changes that the London Zoo did. So from 1849 to 1881, we see that they're starting to make what they considered at the time state-of-the-art exhibits. The London Zoo opened its first reptile house, so specific to that class of animals, in 1849. They opened the first aquarium in 1853 and the first insect house in 1881. During this 19th century, with new zoos opening and others growing vastly in their collection size, it allowed for a flood of new species to be described for science, which is pretty amazing. For instance, in 1876, 3 Pair-David's deer came to the Berlin Zoo from China's Imperial Hunting Park near Beijing, where this otherwise extinct species persisted until the 1900s. This was also a time in which collections were starting to be organized by their taxonomic classification. So if you remember in that menagerie time, we were seeing them not necessarily being organized by a taxonomic classification, but here we're starting to see aquariums, reptile houses, insect houses, all of those things together. We're starting to see a little bit more of a professional animal care standard becoming formalized, and we see the founder level of many of our gene pools in our current zoos today established during this time. And take a look at these exhibits. So these were definitely more of like a diorama style exhibit. You can see on the left is the aquarium at the London Zoo. At the top is the reptile exhibit. And then you see a photo also of that exhibit down below. So they are literally having these animals sit in terrariums, but the terrariums at least look more natural than what we saw in those cages before. One of the key people who really helped bolster the progression of zoos was Carl Hagenbeck. And so first and foremost, he was a supplier of animals for zoos and circuses. And remember, this is a time in which zoos and other collections are literally taking animals out of the wild. He was very well versed in animal behavior and thus able to really capture rare species. So he was a leading supplier for animals, for zoos and circuses. From 1866 to 1886, so in the 20 years that he did this, let's take a look at how many animals he caught and sold. So the numbers show that he sold at least 1,000 lions, 1,000 bears, 800 hyenas, 600 leopards, 300 tigers or more, and around 300 elephants, 150 giraffe, and 150 reindeer. That is a significant amount of animals that were coming out of the wild into this human care setting. And that is certainly why there have been concerns in the past about zoos stealing animals from the wild and doing what we would call plundering the wild, where we're taking all of these animals out of the wild and we're putting them into a human care setting. They die and we go get another one. I can even remember when I was a kid, so well beyond this time, that an animal would die at the local zoo that I was used to. The mountain lion one day wouldn't be in its exhibit anymore, and then a month or two later there'd be another mountain lion in the exhibit. So our mindset for a while in the zoo world was that there are plenty of these animals out there. Let's go ahead and bring them in, and we'll just take them out of the wild, and we'll keep taking them out of the wild because there's So let's look at some of the significant animals that Hagenbeck actually brought into the zoo setting. Two of the most notable that I want to point out to you about the species, the rare species especially, that he is responsible for is the Przewalski's horse and the pygmy hippos. So take a look at this name. It's Przewalski, even though it's spelled Prze. Some people call them P horses. Some of them do say Przewalski's horse. The correct pronunciation is actually Przewalski's, but they are a rare breed of horse that we would not have in our gene pool and that would probably not exist today if it weren't for these animals being brought into a human care setting. The same with pygmy hippos, very rare, but we are able now to keep them and keep that reserved gene pool in our human care settings because they were first brought in by Hagenbeck. So even though Hagenbeck had this piece in which he was responsible for bringing these animals in and stocked a lot of zoos and circuses, he was actually best known for his exhibit design. And this is where we actually see a huge leap towards natural exhibits in our zoos today. So Carl Hagenbeck, again, considered to be the grandfather of modern exhibitry. In 1907, he opened this zoo in Hamburg, Germany. The exhibits were, like I said, a huge leap from where they were prior to his contribution. He created the exhibits by taking several different enclosures, separating them by hidden moats. So all of the inhabitants, as you see in this picture, not only appear to have access to a single area, but they also appeared not to be enclosed by anything at all. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see that there's caribou, there's penguin, there's polar bears, there's sea lions, a wide variety of species that look like they could get to each other. But in reality, there are moats that are hidden that keep them separated. Now, is this geographically accurate? No, we don't see polar bears and penguins in nature living in the same habitat. But are they a huge improvement from where we were? Yes, absolutely. We are seeing these animals now being displayed at eye level or above. There are no longer fences or cage-like settings in the way. And so that was a big contribution. Now, I want you guys to think about this from an exhibit design standpoint. What's so awesome about this is that they look like that there are no barriers keeping these animals in. And in fact, there was a term that was coined because of this design called Hagenbeck's heart. And that was a medical condition that was brought on by encountering animals in places where one did not expect to see them. And so people could turn the corner and see these animals and they might get a fright because in heart palpitations because they thought the animal could get out of their enclosure and get right to them. And that is such an amazing experience compared to where they were prior. Now, some of the challenges with these exhibits is where do the animals go when the weather isn't good for them? What sort of shelters did they have in this space? They didn't always have the best shelters. And if they were going to go in so keepers could clean, they often went into these very small exhibits in the back. We call them dens. And so they shifted into these dens, especially in areas where we see this large amount of rock work and concrete. They were concrete dens. They didn't have a lot of sunlight or exposure. And so in inclement weather, depending on the animal, they may spend more time in there than what we would think is great today. But remember that by these standards at the turn of the century, this was state of the art. And it really was a good, a nice leap from where we were. So that was in Germany. We, in 1918, actually saw the first American institution to benefit from Carl Hagenbeck's revolutionary concept, and that was the Denver Zoo. So, City Park, there was the gift of a black bear cub given to City Park, and you can see this picture here on the right, and or on the left, sorry. And that is a picture of City Park with the black bear cub. And that inspired creating this groundbreaking exhibit feature. And this exhibit feature was called, Bear Mountain. And so this was Hagenbeck's first exhibit in the United States. And it was built to look like the cliffs of Morrison, Colorado, and the Red Rock area. If you guys are familiar with that, you can see a picture of what it looks like in its heyday there on the bottom, and then the subsequent Bear Mountain exhibits. There's a depiction of it when it was new on the top. There is a picture of them on a sign at the Denver Zoo, and they call this, in the zoo industry, we call this shiprock. And so you can see that it was made from this massive steel structure because it has to be built heavily to hold all of the rock work that goes around it. It looked like a giant ship, and then it was turned into a rock. Today, we don't see large animals in those exhibits. The last time I was at the zoo, it was a coati that was housed in there. And so they are now starting to make some changes to this. Even though it is on the historic register, it looks like they might be getting permission to make some changes to this and to potentially get rid of it. But this was, at the time, a state-of-the-art exhibit. So a lot of zoos, like the Denver Zoo, over the next 20 years continue to grow. And one of the things that really helped zoos in the U.S. become established and grow was out of the recession and the Great Depression. President Franklin Roosevelt created the Work Progress Administration. And this was a way to get our economy going again, get people back to work. And so the Work Progress Administration paid for people to work on buildings, on roads, and even in parks. And so this is significant to us in the zoo world because at this point we see a lot of exhibits being built around the country because of the WPA. And they were all built between 1933 and 1938. And if you look at when zoos first started, it was around that same time. And so this Work Progress Administration paid people to build a lot of those exhibits. And you'll often see them stamped when you look at zoos and you go into what is this classic sort of old rock work and even some wrought iron. If you look for the letters WPA stamped somewhere, you can often see those and know that those are WPA exhibits. So a really important piece about what was going on in the world at the time that helped the progression and evolution of zoos. For example, the Cincinnati Zoo created the African Belt exhibit in 1934. So Hagenbeck's design really inspired this exhibit. And it also extended into a great increase of the grounds of the Cincinnati Zoo at the time. So again, during this time, we were seeing the WPA doing this. You can see in these pictures that we have rock work for the areas in which the animals would go to when they need to be off exhibit. And we're even starting to see some natural substrates come into here. So you can see in the bottom picture that there is a pond built in, and so a structure in which an animal can get into the water, drink from the water. There, you can see the moats on each side. So these animals are up at eye level. They don't have bars around them. And then natural substrate, which you might see in an African savanna. Now let's take a look at the Bronx Zoo. So the Bronx Zoo took Hagenbeck's concept and they built on it for their 1941 exhibit. And this exhibit still used moats, it still used artificial rockwork, but they also used their existing outcroppings that were natural in this area of New York to make it look more realistic and more authentic. If you look at the black and white photo, you can see the barn in the back, so that's not necessarily as what we would call today as immersive of an exhibit, and we'll get to landscape immersion just shortly. But you can see here that they're still using natural substrate. There are grasses, there are natural rocks. There are obviously some man-made structures like that pond, but they were able to create this significant exhibit that can still be in existence today, which you see in the color. You can see that it was made to look like the lion was sharing space with the zebra and antelope, and they could see each other, and yet they were not able to get to each other. And a lot of people think that this can cause stress. In some cases, when animals are first put into the new exhibit, absolutely it can cause stress. But what's interesting, having worked in exhibits like this, over time, these animals, just like you imagine, start to ignore each other. It's rare that they even, like when I worked at Kansas City, we used to see the cheetah occasionally stalk the savannah or the lion stalk the savannah. And the hoof stock that were on the savannah eventually just came to understand that those animals couldn't get to them. And so you'd see their stress levels decrease. What's really great about this exhibit, if you look in the bottom picture, you can see that there's hoof stock in there. There is, it looks like probably a crowned crane, and it looks like there's a peacock in the exhibit. So definitely an opportunity for a multi-species exhibit if you can do it safely, which is a pretty great integration from, again, where we were. Now we're starting to move a little further into the 20th century, and we're going to start to take a look at how ecology starts to play a bigger role in how exhibits look, the story that we're telling zoo guests, and quite honestly, that we're starting to tell a story to our guests, that we're starting to incorporate information about the animals, not only in their habitats and caring about behavioral biology, but we're starting to look at those stories and inspiring our guests to learn about the animals. And one of the people who made a significant contribution in this way is William Conway, or Bill Conway. So he joined the Bronx Zoo staff as a bird curator in 1956 at the age of 26. And he moved up to director of the Bronx Zoo and then on to president of the Wildlife Conservation Society in 1999. The Wildlife Conservation Society is the overall umbrella for the New York zoos, and so he eventually was in charge of all of the zoos in New York. He really wanted guests to explore an animal's life history, and in doing so, he championed being able to place them in an environment and in an ecological and evolutionary context. So let's take a look at his work. In 1964, he championed the renovation of the aquatic bird building at the Bronx Zoo. And you can see it actually started as one of the original buildings when the Bronx Zoo opened in 1899, and that's the bottom picture that you see there. And then this was the 1964 renovation. And this renovation had a definite goal, and it actually was a fairly simple one. He wanted to tell the story about birds being dependent for their livelihood on wetland habitats, and to show that the type of bird in the place that it lives and where possible, to show that what the birds do, what they don't do, and to tell why they do it. So you can see there's a picture here of the roseate spoonbills, and those are sitting in trees, and you can definitely see that it's a wetland type setting. So very naturalistic. And at the larger black and white picture, you can see that they are actually building the exhibits. And so you can get a perspective of really how big this exhibit starts to look. And here's a overall map of the exhibit. And so it featured herons and spoonbills and rails and stilts and flamingos and ibises, storks, jacanas, avocets, hammerheads, stints, plovers, and more. All of the birds were dependent on wetlands. In the bottom picture, you can actually see the swamp as it appeared in 1971, and this is from the WCS photo collection. And if you look at the diagram, you can actually see what I think is significant to show you here is that there is a specific flow through the exhibit. So there is a specific direction that he wants you to go. There is a specific story that he wants you to tell. And his goal here was for visitors to not just have a recollection of a series of birds in a series of cages, but he wanted them to experience seeing them marvelously adapted to their environments in their typical settings. So this exhibit starts with the treetops and the riverbanks, and then it goes into storks, and then it moves into a tropical lagoon and a jungle stream, and then the water shore, and then it moves into sea cliffs and marshes, and there we see fishing owls, and then there's a pond, an Indian pond, and an African pond, and a swamp. And this is the swamp picture that you see. And even if you look at this map, you can see where there's water, where the plan was for land, what is glass fronted, what is open. And so you see that the swamp has both this open and this glass down low. So glass for protection for both the animals and for the guests. And then this open air, so you get to hear them, see them, smell them, experience them. I know in our birdhouse exhibit that we used to have at the zoo, the open scene, the birds could fly in and out as they chose, and they definitely, when there were less guests, would choose to spend time outside of their exhibit and then fly back in. All right. Now let's talk about another contributor to the evolution of zoos, and this is Heine Hediger. And what I think is interesting about Mr. Hediger is that he not only was the father of zoo biology, he actually named and described some important pieces that we'll talk about in other classes. These two important things of animal behavior are flight distance and critical distance that's used when animals of different species meet, including humans, and then personal distance and social distance that he observed during interactions of members of the same species. And so that's a great example of the contributions that he made. He was the director for 35 years of 3 Swiss zoos and conducted field research on wildlife. And he took that field research and he applied those observations so that the animals that were in his zoos might exhibit more natural and less stressful stereotypic behaviors. These changes included changes in exhibit design. They included changes in keeper procedures that could not only reduce the stress but increase the health, longevity, and reproduction of animals in a human care setting. So that's very important. In the 1950s, he began promoting the concept of training animals in zoos. So this is the 1950s, and he started talking about training animals to elicit biologically suitable behavior. So normal behaviors and appropriate behaviors to afford the animal exercise, physical and mental exercise in their exhibits. So in the 1950s, he started talking about keepers doing animal training. He observed that in some cases, this training increased the opportunity for the zookeeper to give needed medical treatments, which we use training today for that very thing, and more than we have ever before. He also referred to the animal training as an opportunity for what he called disciplined play. And so it's really what we would call today about building relationship with your animal. He also introduced a new concept of this zoo biology. So zoo biology did not exist before Heidegger, and it dealt with such matters as food, food quality for animals, looking at their causes of death, looking at the zoo architecture and the meaning of animal to man and man to animal, or that human-animal connection, and the exhibit value of having animals in zoos. So that's the whole concept of zoo biology, and Heine Heidegger was the father of zoo biology. It took years for these concepts to be widely practiced, and some exhibits continued to be built without a lot of natural landscaping, and thus discouraged natural behaviors. As I always like to point out, it really only takes time and money. Money is often the limiting factor to this. And so being able to build a new zoo and create new exhibits and to always have the state-of-the-art exhibitry for your animals is very expensive. But it can be done, and that's why zoos today have master plans that we'll talk more about in our next class. All right, so we're starting to move into the 21st century, and so we're starting to see even more growth during this time of the exhibit design. Behavioral ecology is coming in, training animals, like I've mentioned, and we're starting to see zoos turn into more of this environmental resource center, the conservation center. We're starting to see zoos go into what we would call zoogeography, in which they are now organizing animals not based on taxonomic classification, but either based on their ecosystem or based on the continent in which they live. And we're really starting to see immersive exhibits come. And so one of the first examples of landscape immersion was in 1978 with Woodland Park Zoo. And so this is really the culmination of the progress to the zoos we see today. Woodland Park Zoo was the genesis of the landscape immersion design. This was the first zoo exhibit to showcase animals in exhibits that replicated their native habitats, and not just replicated them, but it created habitats with live plants in a natural setting, live trees, deadfall, and these were built to be spaces that these animals could live in like a home. Not just an exhibit which may or may not have the comforts, but these were built with the intent that they elicited natural behaviors from the animals. And not only did the habitat change and become unique, but the keeper routines were very different. So instead of having a feeding station and a standard feeding time in which the animals came over, got all their food, and they were done for the day, keepers actually started scatter feeding the zoo or the food throughout the exhibit, and they provided enrichment for the animals, and they fed them several times throughout the day, so in different feeding stations. And so scattering the food allows for foraging, especially for gorillas. That's super important. This is what they would do in a normal day in the wild. And so we are starting to see exhibits not only look like the real habitat that they live in, but we're also giving animals the opportunity to have the choice and to have the enrichment and to be mentally engaged in their environment that they're living in, which was so important. And so we're going to move in from this into our next session next week on today's zoos. And we'll talk more about how this has continued to evolve and how we today are even now starting to look at how we can do better and make it engaging both for guests and for animals. One of the challenges that we saw early on in these exhibits is that the animals aren't always visible. And so it's very disappointing for our guests if they come up to an exhibit and all the animals are hidden. So it's really about identifying how we can benefit the animals and how we can benefit the guests and keep those animals as visible as we can while we're also making the animal comfortable. So we'll talk more about that the next time that we meet. And in summary, here's a few things that I want you to think about and maybe make notes on. First, go back and look at the transition of exhibits that are in this slide. Think about the animal care that changed over time. Make a pros and cons list of each of the types of exhibits that you see on the chart and that I talk about in this video, and come up with both the positives and negatives. There are positives and negatives about each type of exhibit. They both had their purpose at the time, and we grew out of them for certain reasons as well. Think about what influenced the progression of zoos over time, in which people started keeping animals in a human care setting to the era of landscape immersion. And then next we'll talk about basically from landscape immersion through today's zoos, what today's zoos are all about, our regulations, and everything that goes along with that. But I want you to take a minute or two before we get to that next week, and I want you to brainstorm what changes you think happen next to get us to where we are today, and what do you think influenced those changes? Okay? Thanks for listening today. Have a great day.